Here is something the history books almost never mention. When the war in Europe ended, when the guns went silent and the celebrations erupted and the world exhaled after 6 years of the worst violence in human history, Dwight Eisenhower did not celebrate. He sat alone in his headquarters and wrote a letter to his wife. Not a letter of triumph, not a letter about victory or legacy or what he had accomplished. A letter about exhaustion so complete that he could barely describe it. A letter about the faces of the dead that he could not stop seeing. A letter from a man who had spent 3 years sending other people's sons to die, and who was now, in the silence after the guns stopped, confronting what that had cost him. He had won the greatest military victory in American history, and something in him understood, with the clarity that only silence brings, that winning had not made him whole. But that was not the worst of it. 3 weeks before Germany surrendered, Eisenhower visited a place that changed him permanently, a place that explained, with brutal and irrefutable specificity, what the war had actually been about. What he saw there was so devastating that he gave an order immediately afterward that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with the only thing he knew for certain, that what he had just witnessed must never be allowed to be forgotten. What he saw, what he ordered, and why it may have been the most important thing he did in the entire war. That is what this episode is about. This is episode 5, Victory and its Cost. The spring of 1945 moves with the accelerating momentum of a war that has broken its enemy's spine but has not yet finished the work. The Rhine crossing in March 1945, American forces crossing the last significant natural barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland, is the moment that serious military analysts understand means the war in Europe is effectively over. Germany has no strategic reserve remaining. The industrial infrastructure that sustained 3 years of offensive warfare has been reduced by Allied bombing to a fraction of its previous capacity. The Wehrmacht is fighting with the desperation of an institution that has run out of everything except the will to continue. And even that is fraying. Eisenhower manages the final campaign with the same steady orchestration that has characterized his command since the dark days after Kasserine Pass. The competing demands of his army group commanders, Patton racing toward Czechoslovakia, Montgomery insisting on the primacy of his northern axis, Bradley pushing through the center, require the constant management of personalities that regard each other with a professional contempt they do not always bother to conceal. Eisenhower holds the coalition together by force of will and the consistent application of strategic clarity. The objective is German defeat, not the personal triumph of any individual commander, and every resource allocation will follow that objective regardless of whose ego it frustrates. The decision not to race for Berlin, one of the most debated of his command on Recedier, reflects this strategic clarity at its most disciplined. Churchill wants Berlin. The British want Berlin. The symbolic value of the Allied armies capturing the German capital is enormous, and the argument for making it a military priority is not without merit. But Eisenhower's analysis is cold and specific. Berlin is deep inside the agreed Soviet occupation zone. Taking it would cost tens of thousands of Allied casualties for a city that would have to be handed to the Soviets under the agreements already made at Yalta. The military value does not justify the cost. He redirects the American armies south toward the National Redoubt, the rumored Alpine fortress where German leadership is supposedly planning a final stand. The redoubt turns out not to exist in any significant form, but the decision to redirect away from Berlin rather than toward it saves American lives. And Eisenhower, who has been counting the cost of his decisions in lives since Kasserine, considers this the relevant calculation. The German armies collapse sector by sector through April. Surrender negotiations begin at multiple levels simultaneously, individual commanders offering the capitulation of their forces, political figures trying to arrange separate peace deals that the Allied coalition will not accept. Eisenhower refuses all partial arrangements with the patient consistency of a man who has read enough military history to understand that incomplete victories create the conditions for future wars. The surrender, when it comes, must be total. unconditional. Every German force on every front simultaneously. On May 7, 1945, at 2:41 in the morning, in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, the German High Command signs the unconditional surrender documents. The war in Europe is over. Eisenhower is not in the room when the signing happens. He is in his office nearby receiving reports. When the signing is confirmed, his staff expects some expression of the moment, a speech, a statement, something that marks the occasion in proportion to its significance. He records a brief message for the newsreels, characteristically direct and characteristically modest. And then he sits down and writes to Mamie, and the letter he writes is not about victory. 3 weeks before the surrender, Eisenhower visits Ohrdruf. The name means nothing to most people. It should mean everything. Ohrdruf is a subcamp of Buchenwald in central Germany, liberated by the American 4th Armored Division on April 4, 1945. It is the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces, and the soldiers who enter it, combat veterans who have seen more violence than most human beings ever encounter, are so overwhelmed by what they find that their after-action reports read like the testimony of people who do not have adequate language for what they are describing. The bodies. The emaciated survivors who are barely distinguishable from the bodies. The evidence of systematic, organized, industrialized killing conducted with the bureaucratic thoroughness of an institution that has been operating at scale for years. The smell. The specific, physical, irrefutable evidence that what has been done here was not the collateral damage of war, but its deliberate purpose, the calculated destruction of human beings because of what they were. Eisenhower arrives at Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945, accompanied by Patton and Bradley. He is the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, a man who has presided over 3 years of combat and has developed the emotional management that extended command requires, the ability to process horror and continue functioning, to absorb the cost of decisions and keep making decisions, to carry the weight without being crushed by it. Ohrdruf crushes him. He walks through the camp for 2 hours. He looks at everything. He does not look away, does not allow himself the relief of not seeing, does not manage his exposure to what is there. Patton, the general whose physical courage under fire is legendary, becomes physically ill and cannot complete the tour. Eisenhower completes every part of it. What he sees reorganizes something in him at a level below strategy and command, and the professional management of consequence. He has understood intellectually what the Nazi regime was. He has read the intelligence reports. He is known in the abstract way of a military commander who processes information about many things simultaneously, that the German occupation of Europe had produced atrocities on a scale that the word atrocity cannot adequately contain. Ohrdruf is not abstract. Ohrdruf is specific. The bodies are specific. The survivors are specific. The evidence of what was done to specific human beings in this specific place systematically over years is specific in a way that no intelligence report had been and that nothing Eisenhower has previously experienced has prepared him for. He gives an order the same day. Every American soldier in the area, every soldier who can be reached, will visit Ohrdruf. Not as a punitive exercise, not as a military requirement in any conventional sense, but because Eisenhower understands, with the strategic clarity that has defined his entire career, that what has been done in this place and in the places like it will one day be denied, will be diminished, will be reframed and recontextualized, and eventually, if the witnesses do not exist in sufficient numbers, erased. He telegraphs Marshall and Churchill immediately, asking them to send members of Congress and Parliament to see the camps, not to read about them, not to receive briefings, to see them, to walk through them, to stand in the specific place where the specific thing happened and understand with their own eyes what the war was actually about. He writes in his diary that evening the personal record he has kept throughout the war, the private accounting of what he has seen and thought and decided, that he has never felt more certain of the necessity of what the Allied armies were doing. Not the strategy, not the coalition management, not the logistics, the necessity, the fundamental moral requirement of defeating an institution capable of Ohrdruf, and of ensuring that the defeat is complete and the record is unambiguous. The witnesses are sent, they come, they see. The photographs are taken, the testimonies recorded, the evidence preserved with the deliberateness of people who understand that preservation is itself a form of victory. Eisenhower was right. The denial came anyway, has always come, comes still. But the record exists. The photographs exist. The testimony exists. Because a general from Kansas walked through a camp in April 1945 and understood immediately that seeing was not enough, that ensuring others saw was the most important order he could give. Victory produces its own complications, and the summer of 1945 confronts Eisenhower with a set of challenges entirely unlike anything he has been trained for. He becomes, in the months following the German surrender, effectively the military governor of the American occupation zone in Germany, responsible for the administration of a shattered country, the management of millions of displaced persons and prisoners of war, the beginning of the denazification process that is meant to dismantle the institutional infrastructure of the regime that built Ohrdruf. The problems are enormous, the resources inadequate, and the political pressures from Washington, from the other Allied powers, and from the German population itself pull in directions that rarely align. He manages it with the same organizational thoroughness he has applied to everything else, but he is tired in a way that the end of the war has not resolved. The exhaustion he described to Mamie in the letter written on VE Day is the exhaustion of a man who's been operating at maximum capacity for 3 years on the fuel of purpose, the purpose of defeating a specific enemy for a specific set of reasons, and who has now achieved that purpose and found that the achievement does not replenish the fuel. The work continues. The purpose is less clear. The clarity that war provides for all its horror is gone. The political landscape of post-war Europe is shifting in ways that Eisenhower observes with the attentiveness of a man who has spent years reading the strategic implications of events others are still processing as news. The Soviet Union, which has borne the greatest share of the war's cost in human lives, is consolidating its control over Eastern Europe with a speed and a thoroughness that the wartime alliance made possible and that the post-war order will have to reckon with. The division of Germany, the division of Berlin, the beginning of what will become the Cold War, all of this is visible in embryonic form in the months immediately following the surrender to anyone paying close enough attention. Eisenhower pays close attention. He files what he sees. He will need it. The question of Kay Summersby surfaces in the post-war period with enough persistence that it requires acknowledgement. Summersby was Eisenhower's driver and aide throughout the European campaign, an Irish woman of intelligence and charm who worked closely with the Supreme Commander through the most intense years of his life, and about whom rumors of a romantic relationship persist to the present day. What is certain is that she was a trusted and valued member of his personal staff. What is uncertain, and will remain uncertain, the evidence being insufficient for any definitive conclusion, is the nature of the relationship beyond the professional. Mamie knew about Summersby. The knowledge, however imprecise, added strain to a marriage already tested by years of separation and the particular loneliness of a military wife whose husband's absences are not merely frequent, but consequential to the fate of nations. The Eisenhower's marriage in the post-war years is a marriage in repair. Two people who have lived largely apart for 3 years, who have both changed in ways the other is still learning, who are trying to find the terms of a shared life that the war interrupted and that the peace requires them to reconstruct. Mamie is not a simple woman, and the marriage is not a simple marriage. What is true is that they find the terms. They remain married until Eisenhower's death, and the marriage that emerges from the post-war years, whatever its private difficulties, becomes a genuine partnership between two people who have earned the right to each other through everything they have survived. Columbia University comes next, a chapter in Eisenhower's life that everyone who studies him eventually describes as the wrong fit, and that Eisenhower himself seems to have understood as the wrong fit almost immediately. He becomes president of Columbia University in 1948, appointed by a board of trustees who believe, reasonably enough, that the most famous military figure in America will be a powerful representative of one of the nation's most distinguished institutions. What they do not fully account for is that Eisenhower is not an academic, has no particular enthusiasm for the culture of academic administration, and finds the combination of faculty politics and fundraising obligations an environment for which his skills and his temperament are notably poorly suited. He is not unhappy at Columbia in any dramatic sense. He paints, a hobby he discovers during this period and pursues with genuine pleasure. The quiet concentration of painting providing a relief from the relentless social demands of the position. He gives speeches, he meets with donors. He fulfills the obligations of the role with the professional discipline he brings to everything. But he is not where he belongs, and the people around him can see it, and he can see it. And the arrangement suits everyone only until something better presents itself. The something better presents itself in the form of a war. The Korean War begins in June 1950 when North Korean forces cross the 38th parallel and drive south with the speed of an army that has been planning the attack carefully and has achieved complete tactical surprise. The United States, committed by treaty and by the logic of containment to the defense of South Korea, enters the conflict under the banner of a United Nations police action, a formulation that obscures the reality of American soldiers dying in Korean hills for strategic objectives that Washington is still in the process of defining. Eisenhower is called back from Columbia. He is appointed Supreme Commander of NATO, the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Western alliance structure that the emerging Cold War has made necessary. It is, in its fundamental structure, a version of the coalition command he has already demonstrated he can do better than anyone else in the world, now applied to the permanent peacetime requirements of containing Soviet power in Europe. He does it well, as he does everything well, and the NATO posting also serves as the stage from which his next and most consequential role becomes visible to the people who need to see it. Both major American political parties want Eisenhower for president. This is not unusual in principle. Popular military heroes have been recruited for presidential campaigns throughout American history. What is unusual is the specific intensity of the desire in 1952, and the specific reason for it. The country is exhausted and frightened. Korea is grinding on with no clear end in sight. Senator Joseph McCarthy is conducting his campaign of accusation and innuendo with a recklessness that is destroying careers and corroding the civil liberties that the war was supposedly fought to protect. The Truman administration is beset by corruption, scandals, and the accumulating unpopularity of a president who has made too many enemies and used up too much political capital. America needs in 1952 the specific thing that Eisenhower has, and that no other available candidate possesses: the credibility of demonstrated greatness. Not the promise of ability, not the argument for competence, the actual record of a man who was given the most difficult command in American history and succeeded at it, who held an alliance together across years of crisis, who planned and executed the largest military operation ever attempted, who made the decision on the night of June 5th that history would judge him by, and made it correctly. Eisenhower decides in the spring of 1952 that he will run. His reasons are not personal ambition, that at least is consistent with everything else about him. His reasons are the reasons a man who has spent his career in service decides to accept one more assignment, because the country needs him, and because the alternative, a McCarthy-influenced Republican Party or a continued Democratic administration that has exhausted its mandate and seems to him genuinely dangerous, he announces. He campaigns with the smile that America already loves, the specific, complete, full-face Eisenhower smile that is one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. And that is not a performance, but an expression of a temperament that genuinely finds people interesting and genuinely believes that the problems can be solved. He wins in a landslide. The general from Abilene, who spent 20 years invisible and 3 years carrying the weight of the free world on his shoulders, is going to the White House. Episode 6, The Presidency. How he ended one war, prevented 3 others, and built the roads that connected America, and the slow-motion crisis that tested him in ways the battlefield never had. This is Legends of America.